Black walnut is the premier hardwood timber tree in the United States. Prized for the superior quality and natural beauty of the wood, black walnut trees have been extensively harvested during the last century. Black walnut is native only to the eastern edge of Nebraska, but by planting on good sites, the natural range for good timber production can be extended to include about one-half of the state. Black walnut grows best in natural woodlands or plantations where the soil is fertile, moisture is adequate, and the trees are protected from high wind and other environmental stresses. Black walnut trees are grown for many purposes, including nut production, wildlife habitat, beauty, and wood products. If trees are grown for wood products, they should be considered an investment. The market value of black walnut trees often depends on how the trees were cared for when they are young. The only way to maximize return on investment with timber trees is to increase growth or improve quality. Site conditions and tree spacing influence growth rate. Pruning is the forest management technique used to improve quality. Wood quality is related to the number of defects in the tree. Any defect in the tree will show up as a defect in the lumber or veneer cut from the log. Tree defects include scars, seams, crooked stems, hollows, and branches. Deductions in stumpage value are made for defects in the tree. Some tree defects, such as seams or mechanical scars, may result from natural hazards and cannot be prevented. Other defects, such as crooked stems and limb knots, can be prevented by pruning when the tree is young. High-value veneer trees exhibit clear stems with no defects. Before pruning, it's important to understand how a tree grows. A tree contains 3 growing points: the root tips, the branch tips, and the cambium. The cambium is a thin layer of tissue which completely envelops the tree just beneath the bark. During the growing season, cambium cells divide and produce a new layer of wood cells. Each year's cambial growth of wood cells comprises what is generally referred to as an annual ring. A tree's age can be precisely determined by counting the annual rings. When a branch is pruned, new wood produced by the cambium begins to close over the pruning wound. In a few years, the entire wound will be enclosed. Annual rings of wood formed after wound closure will be perfectly clear. Clear wood means higher quality and higher value. The best time to prune black walnut trees in Nebraska is during the late dormant season prior to bud break. Pruning in late February or March has several advantages. There is less chance for attack by decay fungi during winter. Rapid spring growth will permit the wound to close faster. Bark and wood tissues are not as tender during the dormant season, so pruning cuts can be made clean with less risk of damage from tearing the bark. It is also easier to visualize pruning needs when there is no interfering foliage, and you don't have to battle insects, heat, and other discomforts during the winter season. However, if it isn't possible to prune during the dormant season, prune whenever you can. It's better to prune in an off-season rather than put it off and allow the trees to develop poorly. Remember that pruning is an art. Each tree is different and must be judged according to its needs. Some trees need no pruning, others require major effort to train them into the desired form. In general, trees growing in natural woodlands require less pruning. The competition in dense woodlands forces trees to reach for sunlight, and the shading causes lower branches to self-prune. Open-grown trees and plantations tend to be branchier and require more pruning. Pruning should begin when the tree is 2 years old and continue until the tree is 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Trees should be inspected each year and pruned only if necessary to correct growth deformities or improve quality. The main objective of pruning black walnut is to improve tree quality and value. However, tree vigor and growth must also be maintained. There should be a good balance between crown foliage and tree height to ensure maximum food production for the tree. A good rule of thumb is to maintain a balance of 60% crown to 40% clear trunk. When you begin pruning your black walnut trees, you're going to require some specialized equipment, some different types of pruning saws, shears, ladders, and that type of equipment. There's two things I'd like to emphasize when you select your pruning equipment. First of all, try to select the right equipment for the job, and secondly, keep your pruning equipment sharp. There's probably more accidents occur and more poor pruning jobs occur from dull equipment than anything else. Now, in the first few years of pruning, when you're pruning in that seedling and sapling stage in the first, second, third, and fourth year, you're probably only going to require some small type of equipment. One of your main type of equipment is going to be a hand pruning shears. Now, there's two type of hand shears available. One is called the anvil type of shears, where the top blade actually comes down and does the pruning against the bottom flat surface or an anvil surface. Now, these type of shears are good if you're doing the tip type of pruning or lopping some branches or something like that. Now, many people prefer another type of pruning shear, which is the blades actually shear across one another. Now, these type of shears have the advantage in that you can get in close to the stem of the tree and make those flush cuts without leaving a stub. But whichever type of pruning shear that you pick, it's really a matter of personal preference, and use the one that you're comfortable with. One of the major types of pruning equipment that you're probably going to want to invest in is a pruning saw or several different types of pruning saws, because you'll probably be using these saws during the whole pruning process, from the first few years all the way through the age of the tree. Now, there's different types of saws available to do pruning. One of the things I'd like to point out is probably select a regular pruning type of saw made for that purpose. Saws like a carpenter's saw or some of those other type of saws, you can probably do the job, but it might be a little sloppy and it's a lot harder on the operator. So when you get into your small type of pruning jobs, you'll probably want to select a small type of pruning saw. Now, this is a specially made pruning saw with a curved blade about 14 inches long. This was designed for small type of pruning jobs. It's got about 7 or 8 teeth per inch. The teeth are designed so that they prune or cut on the pull stroke. So this is the type of saw you'd use for small type of pruning jobs. Another saw that you'll probably want to select when you get into a little larger size branches or a little higher in the tree is a little larger size pruning saw. Now, basically, this saw is the same principle, the same type of design, just on a little bigger scale. So we have the curved pruning blade. Again, we have the raker teeth. Now, on this saw, we have about 4.5 teeth per square inch, or per inch of blade. So for larger type of pruning jobs, this saw is very efficient. You can almost prune as fast with this saw as you can with a chainsaw. There are other type of pruning saws available, and it really depends on your personal preference which ones you like to use. Now, here's an example of a pruning saw that's got a straight blade. It's got the coarser teeth on the bottom and the narrower teeth on the top so that you can use it for two different pruning jobs. Another type of saw that many people prefer in doing many types of pruning jobs is the old-time bow saw. Again, the type of equipment you use or the type of saw that you select is really a matter of personal preference, and select something that you're comfortable with and that does the job for you. Another piece of equipment that comes in real handy in pruning black walnut is the lopping shears. These type of shears are used for a number of purposes, not so much for pruning in flush with the main stem or pruning branches like that, because you really can't get that close, and a pruning saw usually does a better job of that. The advantage of lopping shears are usually to tip the ends of branches or to lop off branches or to cut out sprouts or things like that, and also being able to work over your head. You can reach up another 3 feet. Now again, there are two types of lopping shears. One is the shear type of action where the blades shear over one another, and again, just like the hand shears, there's an anvil type of a shear that the top blade comes down on an anvil surface. Again, it really depends on personal preference which type of shears you prefer. Lopping shears come in various sizes, but generally the larger shears you can prune or make cuts up to about 1.5 inches in diameter. After your trees have grown for several years and get into that nice straight young sapling and pole size stage, you're probably going to want to get a piece of equipment so that you can do some pruning over your head. Now the pole pruner is a handy piece of equipment for doing that pruning up in the tops of the trees. The basic objective of the pole pruner, of course, is to prune over your head. Now this particular model has the pruning saw attached right to the pruner. It also has a pair of lopping shears there so that you can do both jobs at once. You can do your flush cut pruning next to the main stem. You can do your lopping of the ends of branches or twigs also. By just pulling the rope, the pruning shear closes and lops off the branch. Now there's a couple different models available. This particular model happens to be a telescoping type of pole pruner, so that it telescopes out to about 12 feet so that you can reach up into the tree maybe 15 or 16 feet and do your pruning that way. Another model is the model that comes in sections, so that you have your basic pole pruner, which is 6 foot long, and then you can add 6 foot sections to the pruner so that you can actually get up into the tree about 18 feet. Now this particular model doesn't have the saw attached, it's just the lopping shear, so it would be the pruner that you'd use to lop the end of the branches up high in the tree. There are several pieces of equipment that we really don't recommend used when pruning black walnut trees. It's probably better to use a specially designed pruning equipment like pruning saws and lopping shears to do the pruning, because you can do a better job of pruning and more safely and effectively. One of the things that I see people sometimes use in pruning black walnut trees is a hatchet or an axe. Now obviously this can do a real poor job of pruning because you get those ragged cuts and broken branches and stubs and those types of things. So a hatchet or an axe is really a no-no when you're pruning black walnut trees. Another piece of equipment that people often insist on using in pruning black walnut is a chainsaw. Now normally we don't recommend using a chainsaw for a couple reasons. First of all, especially for novice users, a chainsaw can be very dangerous, can make some very severe cuts in an arm or a leg or a forehead. And also, pruning with a chainsaw can cause damage to the tree very easily. With just a slip of the saw when you're pruning a branch, you can make a severe wound in the trunk of the tree. So normally we don't recommend using a chainsaw because you can do just as good a job and more effective with regular pruning saws and lopping equipment. Normally pruning begins on black walnut trees when the trees are about 2 years old or more. The reason for that is in the first year you're more concerned about just getting the tree to survive and get it established, so you don't need to worry about pruning that first year. But then after your second growing season is when you need to start considering training the walnut tree into just one central stem. Now here's an example of a nice healthy young walnut tree that is 2 years old. You can see it's got one central leader, so there's really no pruning necessary on a tree like this. Here's a walnut seedling in the plantation that could use a little corrective pruning. We've got a 2-year-old seedling here that, as you can see, has got a kind of a fork that is competing with our main leader. So what we want to do is again encourage this central leader to take over as the dominant stem in the tree. So what we'll do is prune off the one stem on this tree. The tools that we use for pruning on young seedlings are really pretty simple. All you really need is a pair of hand pruning shears. Anytime you prune on limbs or branches less than a 1/2 inch in diameter, a pair of hand shears is really all that you need to use. So what we'll do with a tree like this is really some minor pruning, and this forking on 2-year-old seedlings is really rather a common occurrence. But all we need to do is just prune off the tip of the competing branch. This will encourage the central leader to grow into the straight single stem we were talking about. Now there's a couple reasons we do this. First of all, I didn't prune back flush with the trunk on the tree for 2 reasons. First of all, if I prune flush with the trunk on the tree, that's going to make a fairly large wound and make a weak spot there at that junction. So if an ice storm or a windstorm came through, chances are that you could lose the whole top of the tree. Another thing that we want to keep in mind in all of our pruning is that we want to maintain as much foliage on the tree as possible. So by just pruning the tip, we're encouraging the other leader to grow, but we're also going to get some branches and leaves on this stem that will be producing food for the tree. This seedling has grown up the first year, and the terminal bud has died back so that we've got 3 different leaders coming out. Again, what we want to try to do is encourage one strong central leader. So this leader here will probably be the most dominant. It's the biggest and strongest leader. We'll use a little different technique here to encourage this leader into one central stem. We'll use the other 2 forks as support for the central leader, bring these over and use masking tape to hold the tree up in position. So all we'll do is take about 6 or 7 wraps to hold the central leader in position. Now the reason we use masking tape instead of some other material like electrician's tape or wire or string or something is masking tape will deteriorate in about a year and decompose naturally, so that you don't have to come back and remove the tape. Okay, now we've got the 2 minor forks supporting our major stem. Then we'll take our pruning clippers and prune off the tips of those 2 supporting branches again. Now what we've got is the 2 forks just acting as a support system for our major stem that we're trying to encourage. Now after the next growing season, when you have a straight trunk, you'll come back through and trim off the 2 supporting stems. Now here's a seedling that needs a little different type of technique in pruning. I'm not sure what happened here, but it's a pretty common occurrence where you'll have a seedling will grow for a year and then get damaged and get a couple of root sprouts coming back up. So what's happened here is, for some reason, whether it be rabbits or mechanical damage or something, the seedling was damaged and we've got 2 sucker sprouts coming back. Now what we want to do again is encourage one dominant central leader. So all we need to do here is prune back the poorest quality one. So in this case, I would say that this stem here is probably the best quality and straightest leader. So all we need to do is trim out the competing leader, again, as close to the ground as possible or as close to flush with the other stem as possible. Sometimes there are walnut seedlings that there's just nothing you can do with. No amount of pruning on this tree would really help. There's no dominant leader. There's not even any competing leaders. So the type of pruning that we'd use on a tree like this is a little more drastic. We really need to start over again. So what I'm going to do here is prune the tree off, or clip the tree off, just a couple feet above the ground, with the idea here, what we're trying to encourage is some dormant buds along the stem of the tree will sprout, and then later on you can select one of those leaders as your dominant leader. When pruning sapling-sized trees, there's a couple of pruning principles you need to keep in mind. First of all, again, we want to keep in mind to encourage a strong central leader in the tree. Now, this particular tree has one central straight leader, so we don't have to worry about that. The second principle that I'd like to discuss is on trees this size, you begin to do some side branch pruning. And that's the pruning you start doing to get the quality in the tree, is pruning off side branches. So here, one of the things you want to keep in mind is your 40-60% ratio. As a general rule of thumb on walnut trees, when you're doing pruning, you do not want to prune any higher than 40% of the height of the tree. Leave 60% of the foliage and branches on the tree so that there's plenty of tissue there and foliage to produce food for the tree. You also want that tree to grow to its maximum, so with the more foliage it has on the tree, the better growth you're going to get. So in this case, we don't have to worry about encouraging a central leader, but we do want to begin the side branch pruning. Now, roughly this tree is about 15 foot tall, so I'm going to want to prune up to about 6 or 7 feet. So all of these branches you see below about this point are the ones we want to remove at this point in time. Another pruning technique on sapling-sized walnuts, besides the side branch pruning, is what I refer to as selective pruning. Now, many times you have a nice straight stem where you don't need to do much side branch pruning to get that 40 to 60% ratio. But a lot of times up higher on the trunk, you have some branches that will cause some problems later on in the life of the tree. So forget about this particular tree. The branches down below here are small, they're never going to develop very much, so you might as well leave them on to produce the foliage for the tree. But up here about 7 or 8 feet, we have a couple of branches that later on are going to get large and cause a problem for the tree. So at this point in time, instead of pruning off these lower branches, we go in and select out some of the problem branches to prune off. So what I'll do here is prune off one of these branches and probably use that lopping technique to lop off the end of the other branch. Then we've got a nice straight stem, at least up 10 or 12 feet, but we still have foliage on the bottom of the tree to produce food for the tree. Now this tree will have a nice straight stem up to at least a height of 12 or 14 feet. Later on, as the tree grows, we can come in and prune off some of the bottom branches. But right now these branches won't provide competition or get any larger. A common problem with young walnut trees is sometimes the terminal bud gets damaged so that you get a fork or several competing leaders in the tree. And again, what you want to try to do on young walnut trees is encourage one dominant central leader so that you eventually have a straight trunk. Now in this case, you can see the terminal bud got damaged and we've got 3 branches or 3 forks coming out from the same spot. What we want to do is select the most dominant or the best central leader and remove or trim back the other 2. Another thing to keep in mind, if at all possible, is to select the leader on the south side of the tree. The reason for that is in Nebraska our prevailing winds during the growing season are from the south and east. So if you select that branch that's leaning towards the south, the prevailing winds will tend to bend it towards the north or bend it into an upright position. So we're going to select this southern branch as the dominant leader and work on these other two competing leaders. What I'll do is just trim these back so that they're not competing with that leader that we're trying to encourage. Now what that does, that will retard the diameter growth of these two competing branches and allow this one to take off as the main leader. Now eventually you will come in, after the tree has grown more in size, eventually these two branches will be removed. But at this point in time you don't want to remove that much foliage from the tree because again the foliage produces a food for the tree and you want to maximize the growth. When pruning walnut trees, one of the things to keep in mind is not to over prune. Remember to keep in mind that 40-60 ratio. So you want to leave about 60% of the crown of the tree on the tree and only prune up to about 40% of the height of the tree. Now to give you an example, this tree has probably been over pruned. As you can see, it's been pruned up probably to about 80% of the height of the tree. What that does is remove some of these lower branches that are producing food for the tree so that the tree is not growing to its maximum potential. Also, by pruning up this high, you're leaving kind of a top knot of branches on the top of the tree, which can make it catch more wind and get the possibility of breakage in a windstorm or ice storm. Many times some of the walnut trees in the plantation will be as such that they just won't make a tree at all. This is a good example of a tree where it doesn't have a central leader. It's got some mechanical damage on it. Really no potential to make a timber type tree at all. So one of the techniques we'd use here is just to cut the tree off close to the ground and let it re-sprout. The objective of that, or the advantage of that, is that if you cut the tree off, it's already got an established root system supporting this tree. And then it'll send up root sprouts or sucker sprouts, and you can select one of those sucker sprouts as the dominant tree later on. So what I'll do on this tree is make the cut. Try to keep your cuts less than 2 inches high from the ground. Now with this established root system, you'll get some stump sprouts or root sprouts directly from the ground that later on you can select the best one for your tree. When pruning a branch on black walnut, the two main things to keep in mind are first to have a sharp pruning saw so that you can make a nice clean cut, and secondly prune flush with the stem. Now what we mean by flush, you would start your cut in the bark ridge in the crotch between the branch and the stem, and then angle your cut slightly outward. The purpose of that is so that you minimize the diameter of the wound on the tree. If you actually prune flush, you would end up with a large elliptical wound on the tree, but if you angle your cut slightly outward, the diameter of the cut will actually be just the diameter of the branch, and you want to try to minimize the size of the wound. So start your cut right in the bark ridge, angle out just a little bit, so that you end up with the diameter of the wound is basically the same size as the diameter of the branch. When we get to the stage of pruning larger sized trees, in this case pole-sized trees, which we would generally classify as trees being in the range of about 4 to 8 inches in diameter, we still want to keep the main principles of pruning in mind, and that is to maintain a strong central leader or straight stem, which we have in a tree like this, but also to maintain the balance in the tree. Keep in mind that 60-40% ratio so that you maintain that 60% of crown on the tree to produce the food for the tree. Otherwise, when we get to pole-sized trees, there's several main principles or rules of thumb to keep in mind. First of all, if we can't prune a tree up to 9 foot, then we shouldn't bother to do any pruning at all, because our objective in pruning is to make sure that we prune to get high quality veneer logs. Now the minimum size saw log or veneer log that a log buyer will buy is about 8 foot 6 inches. So if we use 9 foot as our minimum criteria, we'll be safe in creating a minimum size veneer log. So if you can't prune a tree up to at least 9 foot, which would be about a foot above my hand, then we shouldn't bother to prune the tree at all, because it's only going to be a saw log tree anyway. Some other kind of general rules of thumb when you're pruning trees is to not prune any branches over 2 inches in diameter. If you prune branches that are very large, over 2 inches in diameter, that makes a fairly large wound on the trunk of the tree, which takes considerable time to heal over. And as the tree matures, it might not have enough time to close that wound and add enough clear wood to be a veneer tree anyway. So try to restrict your pruning to branches less than 2 inches in diameter. Another key point to remember with pole-sized trees is to restrict all of your pruning to trees that are generally less than 8 inches in diameter. The reason for that is by pruning trees less than 8 inches in diameter, you're restricting those defects or those knots to the interior part of the tree, and then the wood that's laid on after that would be clear, so that you get your veneer trees. If you prune trees larger than 8 inches in diameter, for example 10 or 12 inches, by the time those wounds close over and you start adding clear wood, your harvestable tree will have those defects in the wood anyway, and they really won't be veneer trees. So the thing to remember, prune the tree up to 9 foot, prune only branches less than 2 inches in diameter, and prune trees when they're less than 8 inches in diameter. In pruning pole-sized walnut trees, we use the same basic techniques as our other pruning on seedlings and saplings. It's just that we use some different size equipment. We'll use the lopping technique again, we'll use a selective pruning technique, and the side branch pruning. Now this is a young pole-sized tree that has good potential as a veneer tree. It's got a good 9-foot veneer log, but also there's a branch that's approaching about 2 inches in diameter, about 9 feet. Now 9 feet is the minimum size veneer log, but we also want to try to achieve or develop more of a veneer log than that and go even higher. So we might try to develop anything over 9 feet that we can get, whether it be 10 or 12 or 16 feet. Probably 17 foot is about the maximum we want to go to. But on this tree, if we can just work on this one branch at 9 foot, then the veneer log will be even longer than that. So what I'll do here is, rather than take the whole branch off, again we want to retain foliage on the tree, so I'll just lop the tip of the branch off so that it restricts that diameter growth. Then later on, as the tree grows in height, we'll come back and prune the branch off flush with the tree. But at that time we'll have a longer veneer log than 9 foot, possibly up to 14 or 15 feet. Again, we're going to use a lopping technique here on a branch that is kind of a problem branch on the tree. We don't want to remove too much foliage, but we want to restrict the diameter growth of that branch. So I'm just going to lop off the end of the branch. That'll restrict the diameter growth on that branch. We're going to do some minimal side branch pruning here by taking off one branch at about 8 foot. That will still maintain our 60% crown canopy. Now we're going to select a couple branches up in the tree that may cause a problem later when we decide to prune higher in the tree. We've got a branch here that's about 2 inches, approaching 2 inches in diameter. We've got another branch up above that's approaching 2 inches in diameter. If we leave some of the smaller branches on the stem and prune out these problem branches now, they won't be there to create a problem later when we prune up higher on the tree. So I'm going to remove this branch. And also one other branch. Now we still have smaller branches on the trunk of the tree to produce foliage and food for the tree. But yeah, we've removed the branches that could be problem branches later. When pruning and training young black walnut trees, remember to restrict your pruning to trees less than 8 inches in diameter. If you prune large trees, those pruning wounds that you make will not have time to close over, so that they will always be defects. Even though the log may be large, they will still be defects in that log. So remember to keep your pruning wounds restricted to that central core on small trees. Now if you get into larger trees, anything over 8 inches in diameter, but definitely anything over 12 inches in diameter, if you prune limbs off of trees, large trees like this, it may make the tree look like it's clean and not have very many limbs or defects, but the thing you have to visualize is that this tree is probably going to be harvested in another 16 or 20 years when it's around 20 inches in diameter. And right now it's about 14 inches in diameter. So if you prune off some of these limbs now, it's going to take several years before those wounds can close over, and by the time the tree gets to harvestable size, you're still going to have a defect in that log. So on large trees like this, it really does no good to prune off live branches. You might as well just leave those limbs on there so that they make solid knots in the lumber, rather than taking the chance of pruning them off and having decay and other problems set in that may be a hole in the lumber or another defect in the lumber. The only time that you would really do any pruning on large trees is where you get into sanitation type of pruning, where you might have an insect or disease infestation, or you might have a broken top from a storm or something like that that you need to prune out just to maintain the health of the tree. But to do any side branch pruning for quality control, it really doesn't pay to do any on large trees. Oftentimes on larger trees or where pruning has been neglected, you'll have a dead branch on the tree that the landowner may want to prune off. And there's a couple things I'd like to point out here. Basically, the technique of pruning is the same, but I'd like to point out some of the cautions here. First of all, when pruning a dead limb, there's a collar area or a callus area that's forming around trying to close off that dead limb. When you prune a dead limb, you don't want to damage that collar or that callus tissue. So when you make a pruning cut on a dead limb, come out just a little ways and prune the limb off. Now, a lot of times people will try to prune flush with the trunk of the tree, and they'll actually damage that collar and get into live tissue so that you provide an avenue attack for decay. But if you prune outside of that collar, then the tree is going to be able to close over that wound much more rapidly and without the chance of decay. So we'll prune here, and watch where my saw cut is. Will be just outside of this collar without damaging any live tissue. Now you can see we've pruned the limb off. We've still got the callus tissue there with no damage on it, and just a very short time that wound will close over. Where if we'd have pruned flush with the trunk of the tree, we'd have made a large new wound that would take a lot longer to close over and also provide an avenue of attack for decay. Remember, the objective of pruning black walnut trees is to develop a straight, clear-stemmed tree. Pruning when trees are young will assure veneer quality trees that will command a premium price in the timber market.